press the go live button. You're now live.
Okay, thank you very much. I've just got to do the blurb at the beginning of the meeting. So just so everybody is aware, the meeting is being recorded and streamed live and conducted in accordance with the Council's remote meetings protocol and procedure rules. Please can I ask that if you would like to speak, you raise your hand, but if I miss you, please do speak up. Please, if you're not speaking, can you mute your microphone? We do encourage people to leave their cameras on, but we understand that sometimes this isn't possible and can impact the quality of your internet. Assent will be by general assent, so I will ask if you disagree, if you can make yourself known. And Joanna, I believe you can take a list of who's present from the list on the screen. Is that all right, Joanna?
Yes, I can do that.
Perfect. So if we go straight into agenda item 1, so I've got apologies for absence and substitute members. I've got a couple, but Derek, Joanna, have you got any?
I don't have any.
Okay, in that case, I've got Ruth Jackson, who will be joining us as soon as she can. She is substituting in for Karen Davies, which is the primary head vacancy. So Ruth Jackson will join us at some point. Welcome to Stuart. Nice to see you. And welcome also to Paul. Is Paul with us, the trade union representative? Okay, so Paul may also join us as the meeting goes on, and so we'll offer him a warm welcome. We are aware that there are still some vacancies, particularly for a primary and secondary governor representative, and Paul, that's progressing, but just taking a little longer than expected.
It's taken a lot longer than I expected, to be quite honest. Yeah, it's a struggle, especially in the secondary sector. We've only got one secondary school, but yeah, we've got a few names, and we're just trying to persuade them that a little bit more now.
Okay, and then one more from me. I've got a year 9 options evening this evening, so I've got to go at 5:30, and Liz is very kindly offered as vice chair to take over the meeting at that point. So my apologies for leaving early, and my thanks to Liz for picking that up. Okay, so if we go on to item number 2, which is declarations of interest, we have picked up a couple here in relation to the high needs block, because that could potentially affect Kennel Lane, Garth and Owlsmore. So any representatives linked to those schools may want to declare an interest, but we don't believe there's any significant interest there, so it's not a withdrawal, it's just a declaring your interest in the item. Do I need to say anything else on that, Paul?
No, I think it's just the general, as the meeting progresses, if there's anything that you think does require a declaration, and if you do it at that time, please, I think that's the sensible approach here. Nothing's jumping out at us, but you can never know how these things go.
Lovely, thank you very much. Yeah, so just chirp in if something directly affects you. So that moves us on to item number 3, which is minutes and matters arising. I've only got 2 that I can see, so I'm on page 3 of the pack, and that was for you, Paul, and for the other Paul to join us. But we thought
Paul is here now. He has.
Oh, there he is. Sorry. Hello, Paul.
My apologies. I've technical issues. I'm just useless.
No worries. We welcomed you just a minute ago, but we'll welcome you again. Nice to see you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you very much for taking the time to join the forum. So
no
a warm welcome. And then I've got another matter arising on page 4, which was Cheryl to ask Councillor Barnard to look into the Ukrainian place funding.
Thank you, Stuart. Yes, I spoke to Councillor Barnard. I can't see if he's on the call at the moment.
I am on the call, but I'm having connectivity issues. But yeah,
would you like me to?
Yeah, if you could just take us through, Cheryl, that which you identified, please.
Of course. So during the meeting, if this was a number of meetings ago, Our colleague from Sandhurst School, Debbie Smith, raised about funding for Ukrainian pupils. We said we would take it away. I followed up. Councillor Barnard has had a look at the funding. We've had a discussion, and at this point in time, it would seem to be appropriate the way that the funding is distributed. However, we are happy to monitor going forward.
So I think the outcome of the consultation has come out to schools.
Yes, that's
since
correct.
that.
And schools have been contacted since then with a letter that went to all schools.
And I know when we look, this is potentially outside the remit of the schools forum.
It is, but we have followed it up. As we
Okay,
said.
so it has been raised. Debbie, are you happy that it's been raised? Maybe perhaps not with the outcome, but it's been raised.
I'm happy that it's been raised.
Can
Thank you.
I just
And I
ask,
have raised a further query outside of this as well, since we all got our letter, but I'm happy that it's been raised.
Can I say, Debbie and others, that I'm more than willing to receive feedback as we go forward. It's exactly as Gerald says, to see if we need to sort of relook at various aspects of it as well to make sure that we continue to meet needs. So please don't consider the matter closed if there's additional information or there are other thoughts you want to take forward. Absolutely willing to, discuss, champion, and look at them for you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In that case, if we move on to the main agenda, so agenda item 4, we've got the proposals for the early years block, and I think it says that this is Paul, but I think it's Cherry presenting this. Is that right?
Yes, please, Cherry, please.
I'm happy for Paul to do it, but I'm not sure he's so happy to do it.
Sorry, Cherry, I've just got a hand up from Joanna. Go on, Joanna.
Okay.
Yes. Have we approved the minutes?
Yes, good point. Are we all happy with the minutes? Lovely. They are approved. Thank you. Well done, Joanna.
Thank you.
Sorry, Cherry.
That's okay, Stuart, no problem at all. Yes, so I was here in the December meeting talking about the formula for the early years funding, and at that point we hadn't had notification of our amounts for next year, and we were really fortunate that it came on the 16th of December. So as you can imagine, it's been quite a tricky time to get the papers together. And what we agreed, or you agreed in September, was to keep the formula as it was and put any increase into the base rate moving forward. So that's the paper that we're sort of proposing tonight. So we did receive 4.9% increase from the department, or we will be receiving 4.9% increase from the department for 3 and 4 year olds, a 9.9% increase for 2-year-olds. But with some of the adjustments that have been made and the census point, the differences that have happened with the census point from the DFE, we are putting a proposal for indicative funding to increase by 5.4% for 3 and 4 year olds and 13.5% for our 2-year-olds. So a bigger increase than we're actually getting. The funding increase for 3 and 4 year olds is expected to represent a real terms cut. And I think that's really important to know, because we know that costs are increasing all the time, especially utilities. So although it's positive that there is an increase, we're not convinced that it's in line with all the increases that are happening in the cost of living, etc. But it's really difficult to look at what that real-time cost would be to the private and voluntary sector, because although we do have some information, obviously the nature of the sector is very different, from having childminders to having people in rented accommodation, to people with mortgages, to providers in schools. It's a whole, it's such a wide spectrum. It's difficult to really be able to pinpoint exactly what that looks like. The new data funding indicates a 10% increase, but the actual increases are lower to finance funding protection areas, which would otherwise be subject to funding cuts. So we've seen a decrease. Well, a decrease. We haven't had all of the funding that they're saying we should have. We would have got more in had they given us the higher rates, but we are where we are. We have proposals, and at least there is an increase. So I don't know if anybody's got any questions about how we're proposing to use the funding that's coming in. If there's any questions from anybody or anything else that needs to be explained.
Any questions? It's the case that it's not enough in a real terms cut, but am I reading that it might have been slightly better than we thought?
Yeah. I mean, we're positive that we're able to say there's an increase. Obviously we wished it was more, but it is, we've done the best I think we can with what we've got available, and we have kept, it's quite interesting. I know we're most worried about Bracknell Forest, obviously, but we've done quite well in comparison to some of our neighbours when we've been looking at what they're getting. So, you know, we're feeling positive, but would have liked more.
Okay, so that's a summary, and we've all had the paperwork. Is there any more questions or queries?
I would agree with Cherry. It's certainly the biggie. I've been working in early years in the borough for almost 2 decades now, and it's probably the biggest increase we will have seen. However, as with all of our budgets, it's still not going to cover what it costs to deliver a place, you know, for a quality place for a child. However, we're very grateful for the indicative increase that potentially is en route to us. So thank you, Cherry, for all your hard work on that. And indeed, David, because I know he had a right headache on the term.
Absolutely did. Thank you, Sue.
Thank you, Sue. Yeah, so I think we'll have a note in the minutes. Oh, sorry, we've got some hands up, but to note in the minute that we recognise that whilst this is some good news, it is still a real terms cut in terms of what we're having to deliver. Grant.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I was going to ask that we did note that, because I think we should celebrate that it's a good increase. But actually, when you compare it to energy costs, even with the recent government announcement and just general inflation, it is going to put pressure on providers. And I just wondered, actually, Cherry, and this is not really a budget question, but it's actually something, is that has the council done any kind of risk assessment about whether we're going to see, you know, providers actually being unable to continue, which will then put pressure on places? You'll recall, Cherry, you worked with me when I was head at Wildmoor Heath, and we closed the nursery because actually in a small nursery, it didn't take too many children not to be attending nursery before it became unsustainable to run. And actually the danger was that the school was subsidising the nursery, was subsidising childcare from resources that were supposed to be for general education. So I just wondered if the council was doing any work, had any sense of doing some risk assessment around the borough to make sure that actually that going forward we do have the places that we want, and we're not going to see providers going under.
Yeah, absolutely, Grant. I mean, it is an ongoing piece of work. We always encourage our providers to come to us as soon as they realise there could potentially be an issue. So we do that proactive work with them to look at, you know, what's not working for them. And we have had cases in the past with some providers where they were looking like they were going to have to close, but actually with some input from my team have been able to turn that around and actually become, you know, sustainable and sometimes very slightly profitable, but not significantly. I think we're doing lots of mini surveys at the moment to try and understand the picture. We're also looking, I think sometimes what is happening with some of our providers, if they're not able to offer the 30 hours, so if they're only open for mornings, they're less sustainable because because the nature of parents' work has changed. So again, I've got a meeting, I think next week, with one of our providers that is struggling. So we're looking at working with them to how they can potentially change their business model to make it more sustainable. We've also got, and this is recruitment and retention, but one of the other issues that lots of people are having is recruitment and retention. So we've got some sessions that we're commissioning for providers over the next couple of weeks where we've brought somebody in to talk to them about recruitment and retention, because some of our providers are full, but they're only full because they can't get any more staff, so they can't have any more children. So it's an ongoing piece of work, Grant. So we do the best we can to support everybody.
Thank you, Cherry.
Lovely, thank you very much. So with that caveat in the minutes that we welcome an increase, but note that it's still a real terms cut. We'll go to the recommendations unless anybody else has got any queries. Okay, so we're on page 9 of the pack, and I'm looking at 2.2 that the forum considers the early years budget proposal from the council and agrees to 2.1, 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 and 0.4. Does anybody disagree? Okay, so the forum has agreed to that. And then the second point, so 2.1.5, we are noting the impact of the funding protection introduced by Department for Education in the latest DSG on early years funding. So that is noted. Well done. Thank you very much, Cherry.
Thank you.
So I think before we move on to item 5, we just need to make a slight change to the agenda, Paul. We're going to add in some late information we've got here about delivering better value. Am I coming to you, Cheryl, for this? So we're just going to add an item in here because it relates to what's about to come in item 5. So if I can ask Cheryl to give us an update on the delivering better value project.
Thank you, Stuart. So colleagues, just to refresh your memories, delivering better value is a DFE initiative working with approximately 50 local authorities in England to explore and ideally to identify how we can reduce or bring the high needs budget deficits into line. Significant work's taken place over quite a few numbers of months, and a lot of officer, head teacher and stakeholder time has been taken up in working with the DFE's delivery company, which is Newton Europe, on exploring and developing the data and the picture and understanding the context, which has been really helpful. It's been really helpful in many ways. Significant data work has been undertaken, analysis of cases and understanding what could be done better if, and that has led to the stage where we are at currently, where we are now required to submit a bid for £1 million of funding, and that funding can be used to undertake work that will lead to a sustainable position and help us to implement changes that over time will help alleviate some of the issues that are underlying this deficit budget. Thank you to colleagues who are on the call tonight who have been involved. You've given up a significant amount of time, and a big thank you to the colleagues who aren't here, who also have given up time. We've now got to the stage with a steer from the DFE as well over which projects are likely to get through the process. There is no clawback on this £1 million. However, we've got to be really clear what we're going to use it for. And everyone within the groups were very clear that we're looking for a sustainable solution rather than a quick fix that then doesn't lead to anywhere in the future. So with all that in mind, we have been working on a very high level submission at this point. We don't need to put the fine detail underneath, but we do need to be clear that we are linking it to the data and the information that's come out of the research so far for Bracknell Forest, that the proposals will target areas that would suggest need resolution and support. And they've now got to the point of 3 proposals. One is universal training across mainstream, focusing more or less on ASDS, speech language communication needs, focusing on non-EHCP young people and also EHCP young people. There are 2 elements to it. It's looking at providing funding to free up staff to attend the training. It's looked at a train the trainer model. It's looking at developing training resources and upskilling to support schools to identify and meet the needs of young people in the classroom. We've also looked at specialist resource provisions and how, when the young people are not in the actual bespoke room, when they're in the main part of the school, either in primary in a classroom with other children or in secondary attending different lessons, there's a real need to support staff in that delivery and understanding of the needs of the children. So that is all part of this when I say non-EHCP and EHCP young people, and how we can put in place training, resources, upskilling. And this will ultimately enhance the offer that we want to put in place with the SRPs, because as you recollect, in the review that Nathan did for us, there were areas where schools weren't sure what they were taking on and found that they didn't feel they had the skill sets. So all this we've considered. The second area is Kennel Lane outreach. Now, this is a historic proposal of about 2 to 3 years ago, where there were proposals from Kennel Lane to do outreach work with young people in small groups, and then to develop a toolkit and the tools to support staff in schools to work with these young people and develop that inclusive practice, but also to meet needs in mainstream schools. And we went to Jenny, and she's kindly considered what that would look like going forward. So there's a fair bit of work to do on updating that proposal. And today we were quite clear that this couldn't just be primary, it has to be primary and secondary. That is the key area for us. So as I say, it's a high level proposal at this point in time, and the detail needs to be worked through. The third proposal we're putting forward is around transition. As we know, young people, when they transition, it's a really difficult time. It's particularly difficult for young people with additional needs of any type, particularly our ASD, SLCN young people. And so we're looking at a proposal of developing a transition team, working with young people in primary and supporting them into the move to secondary and continuing that support for some time. And also then working with staff in the schools about developing provision and meeting need. So those are the headlines today. And I'll reiterate, the first one is a universal training offer about releasing staff, about training, train the trainer, and supporting across all our schools. The second one is slightly more focused, Kennel Lane outreach, primary and secondary, focusing on small groups of ASD young people and how they can be targeted and supported in school going forward, but also training up the staff so they take those skills into the future. And the third one is around the transitions over quite a long period of time. And the proposal is to develop a transition team. And we would have to look at in the future how that could be sustained going forward. But what we have discussed is, if we were to deliver this over 2 years, we would then have the data and impact assessments to strengthen that argument for more permanent funding in the future. So that's the overview. I'm happy to take questions from colleagues in the forum. Thank you.
Any questions?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for listening.
I've got some comments in that case.
Okay,
Sorry.
Stuart, thank you.
Just to say that I think this is good news. It's £1 million that's coming in to help out. And I also think what's useful about that grant is that every local authority involved in the project got the same amount. So as a relatively small local authority, we've got quite a large sum of money. And just so Forum are aware that Liz and I were invited to take part in a meeting at the back end of last week for head teacher involvement, and then latterly Jenny's come along today. Sorry, Simon was there last week as well. So there's been a few of us sat in. I think, Cheryl, it's fair to say that this element of the project has happened pretty quickly. So they've only just fed back with their data and evidence last week, and within 2 weeks you've got to submit the grant bid, and the grant bid has got to stick very closely to the evidence that they found in the project presented last week. So timescales have been tight, but I think unavoidably so. And I think fellow heads that were at that meeting, I think we're happy that we're on the right lines, and that the bid going forward addresses the particular issues that were raised by the consultants. If Liz, Simon, or Jenny want to speak or not.
I'll jump in then. Just to say, I think the discussions that everyone's having, there's some really innovative thoughts about how to offer something that will make a lasting impact. £1 million will make for our local authority something that could really level off the cliff we were starting to walk over. Fix my metaphors, but it's fantastic, and it's nice to be part of something so positive.
Any other comments? Okay, is that all you need from us, Cheryl? This is just information providing. We don't have to do anything.
You don't need to do anything. Very happy to take on board any comments or feedbacks or thoughts. The submission date is the 23rd of January. There is no time limit actually over this money. We've not been told it's got to be spent in this specific year. So we've tried to stretch it out to make sure we can have some lasting impact. And I think the key thing for us is looking for sustainable models going forward, and what would that look like? So in the background, there is other work. And I think, Stuart, you did flag up in 2 meetings that working with the local authority in different initiatives, we need to ensure that schools are not bombarded with lots of different things. We, in the next few years, need to be very focused and bring things together and integrate, because schools cannot and do not have that capacity to deal with lots of different projects and initiatives. And I've taken that on board. So the work we've discussed about inclusion at the head teacher meetings would be part of this. I would see it as all being working together. And if there were any triad reviews or peer reviews, that the same schools would be working together, because that you've only got so much capacity. But we are excited, and thank you everyone for your support. It's been much appreciated.
Okay, thank you very much. And I believe we've emailed secondary heads, and they've got an opportunity to email comments back. And I think there's a meeting of the primary heads tomorrow, so there's an opportunity for further comment there. So thank you very much for that update. So now we can move on to the actual agenda, item 5, which is the high needs block. And Paul, I think you're taking us through this one.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, so this is basically the next stage of the process in setting the 23-24 high needs block budget. So there's nothing really new introduced in terms of initiatives at this stage of the process. They're the same things that we agreed before Christmas. What we've done.
Sorry, Paul. Jenny, you just declaring an interest, Jenny.
Yes, please.
Sorry, I missed that.
We'll note Jenny's interest. Thank you. Sorry, Paul.
Okay, no problems. So yeah, so this is the next stage of the budget setting process. There's nothing new in terms of initiatives, and the things that Cheryl was just talking about in terms of the firming up of our bid for the delivering better value, that's not reflected in this yet, because obviously it's very, very new and still evolving. But this is the first time we tried to put some figures towards that, those proposals, and we've also stretched the medium-term financial plan another year to 25-26, so there's more information in there now. And then the next meeting of the forum in March is the final opportunity to set the budget. So obviously it's important that anything that comes that is not properly reflecting your views or anything that we've missed, we need to capture that today to make sure that we can ensure that everything comes to you in March. That is what you're expecting to see and the best position that we're in. So just important that we follow that through as well. So it's a very similar sort of report you've seen as we've built up the budget in previous years if you've been on the member for a while, on the forum for a while. So there's not much for me to go through in the detail, just very much on the highlights. The budget position, as you'll have seen from the report, is very similar to the last few years. We are still getting big increases in income from the government. So that was further increased as part of the budget statement. So we were originally expecting a 5% increase in income next year. It was increased by another 4.6% out of the budget announcement. So it's close to 10% now. But even with that increase, we're still looking at a £7 million a year deficit for 23, 24, 24, 25 and 25, 26. That's come down a bit from the deficit this year, which was around £7.4 million. But we're still struggling to bring that deficit down to any great significant amount. Part of the reason of that is that the bigger projects we're working on are much more longer term nature. So we've talked before about trying to develop extra places in special schools, new schools. The SRPs are things that are taking their time to work way through the funding process. So we are expecting those to start to deliver some bigger savings. We are expecting some mitigations out of the Delivering Better Value programme, and we are expecting some improvements to emerge through the response to the Ofsted inspection as well. So there's other things that we are expecting to come through once we get a better understanding of the outcomes from that, and hopefully that will start to bring those deficits down. But at the moment, obviously, we're not got enough confidence in what's coming out of those programmes to build them into our forecasts. Yeah, we are getting towards some really, really big deficit figures now. I mean, they were really big before, but they're very, very, well, I'll leave it at they're really, really big. So if everything stays on the forecast that we've got now, and obviously it will be updated every year, so it will be changing each time we have a look at this, we are looking at a potential £44 million cumulative deficit at 25, 26. That's just on the high needs block. So that's the level of overspend we would have incurred since the first time our high needs block went into a deficit in 2019-20. So to say, we are working with you to reduce that over time, but we haven't got any confidence in plans to put those into the figures just yet. And so just to summarise the key assumptions of how we've been building up this budget and the things we're looking at, we are still expecting increases in government funding, but they're expected to be much, much lower going forward. So we've had 8, 9, 10% increases in the last 3 or 4 years. We're expecting that to be 3% from 24, 25 onwards. That's the advice from the DfE plan on that assumption. We are still expecting to have increased numbers of education and healthcare plans, but the trend of increase is lowering. It's been coming down the last few years, and we're expecting that trend to continue. So those forecasts are for lower increases, but still increases in each of those 3 years. We are still expecting a high level of inflation next year, but again, looking at the forecast from the Bank of England, they are looking to rapidly reduce thereafter. So we're building those sort of figures from the Bank of England into our forecasts, and we are obviously expecting some of these plans to come through and reduce the number of pupils being placed outside the borough as well. So that's how we've brought the budget together. The actual report sets out the initiatives again, but I said we've been through those before. Some of them have been running through for a couple of 3 years now. The other thing, just to remind you again, is that we did have hanging over us the liability of the debt on the high needs block budget, which is currently being held by the DfE and outside the local authorities' accounts, as it were. That was due to end at the end of March this year, but that's been extended another 3 years. So again, that indicates the scale of the issue the DfE recognised local authorities are in at the moment. So when that does come back, because I'm sure it will come back to local authorities, there'll still be an issue about, well, what are we all going to do with our deficits at that point in time? So it's only talking about getting us to a position where we're balancing our budgets. There will still be a significant debt to consider, but that's a number of years into the future. But obviously, it's still a big concern to the council, and I'm sure it is to schools as well. So I don't think I don't want to pick out anything in detail. So that's the overview of the finances, I think, and I'll be happy to take any questions, and I'm sure if there's any operational ones, I'm sure Cheryl will be able to pick those ones up as well. So I think that's all I'd like to say then, Stuart.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Any questions or comments? Okay, I got a couple. First of all, just to note that the forum had asked you guys to consider working with other local authorities on any of these issues, and so thank you for looking into that. I think you've done some work on therapeutic care, so thank you very much for picking up on that. I think it's also worth noting that the top-up funding coming to schools has been increased by 5.4%, and I think similar to Cherry's comments earlier, grateful that those top-ups are being increased, but obviously not increasing in line with costs. And then I think the other thing that I wanted to note was that in the past, Forum has challenged Paul and the local authority about these figures coming through very late, and then finding ourselves in a position at the next meeting where we've got to vote these things through without any real chance to make a change or dig deeper. And so, Paul, thank you very much for getting this information to us. I know you've received that information very late, but it does give us a chance to consider before we get the final version. And I think that's what you're asking us for in the recommendations in 3.2. So is there anything else Forum members would like to see in advance of that next meeting to help us make decisions? I see heads shaking. I can't think of anything either. So and normally I'm looking to Grant to help us make a comment here that I do think the Forum notes again concerns around the size of the annual deficit and the cumulative deficit and the potential impact when that falls back on the local authority for our students with additional needs in the future. So Grant, are you happy with that? That's normally, yeah, just that we've got a note of that in there somewhere. Are there any other questions or comments before we move to recommendations? I'm aware we're getting through this remarkably quickly and I'm leaving nothing for Liz. She'll be very disappointed. Okay, in that case, can we go to page 22 to the recommendations? So we've got 3.1, the Forum notes the updated medium-term financial plan. Are we all happy to note that? Thank you. And that Forum agrees to any further budget developments. Well, I think we've talked about that, Paul, and I don't think we've got anything for you other than what you're already working on.
Yeah, I think that's what I really wanted to know, just if there's anything else you want us to look at before the final set comes through. So thank you for that.
I do think under the bit where you're looking at your plans going forward, so I think it's item 7 on page 27, you're talking about cost reduction plans, so things like increased use of SRPs and the number of Bracknell Forest residents going to Kennel Lane. There's several recommendations in there, but there remains a commitment from the local authority to achieve those. And the reason I'm saying that is because we've got that delivering better value money, but we're not using some of it to achieve those cost reductions, and that's because the council are committed in the medium term to deliver those cost reductions. Is that correct?
That's right. The delivering better value money is an addition to what we were already planning to do in those areas. So it's not a substitute for anything that we'd provided planning to do. It's additionality.
Yeah, I just wanted that noted. Sorry, Stuart, you got your hand up.
Yeah, just a query on that item 7 there about the increased use of SRPs. It mentions about King's Academy Binfield, and the original plan, I believed, was that they received funding for the 40 SRP places originally. And it says that there'll be more capital investment there needed. And I'm just wondering why there's more capital investment needed. Really.
Carol, do you want to pick that one up?
Yeah, happy to. When the DFE, the financial arrangement for that academy was agreed, it was agreed that 40 places would be provided. However, the finance for running them is not set within that budget. That will come through for any other school through our local budget. So part of their funding agreement was they would provide 40 places. So far they've provided 1. We are negotiating with them now to start opening up those places and what it will look like. Officers have been to do site visits, and there is a dialogue currently taking place about the part of the building that was set aside for this purpose. So we are currently looking at that, and there are a number of questions we have around this at this point in time. But the places would be funded. They're not funded centrally. They would be funded from us because they're commissioned from us.
Okay, so wouldn't the EHCP money go towards that anyway? If a number of those pupils had EHCP, so that would go towards funding the staffing.
Yeah, it will be the same as any other SRP, whether it's an academy or not. The funding model for us, the question is around the suitability of the building and the space put forward for accommodation of the SRP. That's what we're looking at currently.
Yeah. But I assume that with the money they originally got, that would have been part of the planning of the building originally to make sure the building was suitable for this facility.
And so that's what we're looking at.
Yeah. Yeah. So if they haven't used the money that way, then surely that's a question, isn't it?
And well, they received the building. They took over the building. The building should in a build, it should be designed according to the needs and the agreement. And I believe it's BB 103, BB 104, I think. I can't remember which is which. That's what we're currently looking at. We're looking at the build, we're looking at the accommodation, we're looking at what the agreement was in the funding. So that was part of their setting up as an academy. And we've got further meetings next week. So we're trying to move that along, but we need to make sure from the point of any children that the accommodation, the SRP is all fit for purpose to deliver what it needs to. And so we are working through that process, Stuart.
Okay, yeah. From my point of view, it's just a case of they've already received funding and perhaps other settings could have used that funding better to have this up and running straight away. But obviously you're investigating that.
We are. Yeah, thank you.
I think Stuart, if I can say it's Gareth here, that's a very fair comment.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think it's absolutely worth noting the forum's concern about that. If capital money has been allocated to deliver something, spending more capital money to deliver what should have already been there is a concern.
Yes.
So perhaps we can get an update on your progress at the next meeting. Cheryl, is that fair?
Yes, by March. Yeah, it's just we need to go back to the original design and the commissioning and look at it carefully and check. We're doing really tight checks along the timeline to see. But as I say, until we're really clear, it's really hard to say too much. But we are doing a due diligence around this to make sure, because we need those places.
Okay, I think, Paul, you had your hand up next.
So, yeah, I just wanted to clarify something. I'm not sure that it might be crystal clear or not, just to be absolutely sure that we're only funding on a revenue basis the places that are actually commissioned. So although there's provision for 40, we are only buying one at the moment. It's not like they're getting funding for the 40. I just want to make sure that's absolutely clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for clarifying that. I think our first point is about the accommodation being offered. Is it fit for purpose for the needs of
I'm going to get commissioning on the case next week. I mean,
so thank you.
Okay, thank you, Neil. Okay, there were a couple of hands that went up and down there, but I think the fact they've gone down probably means we've covered it. I'm seeing some nods.
And I've just said this, Cheryl's had a thing sent through about.
Neil, do you know your microphone's on?
I've just said I'll update you. I don't want anything.
Not sure he does.
Neil.
Say it's the same as Windsor. Exactly the same as Windsor.
Neil.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good. It's gone on mute. Sorry about that, Neil. We could hear your conversation. Okay. So I think we've done everything on item 5. We've covered off those recommendations. So we now move to item 6. And actually, Paul, I think you've got some changes or some slight changes you want to make into how we deliver this. So over to you, Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. Yeah, I just wanted to split the report into 2, basically, just to go through the budget process to get to the level of where we can afford a budget at the national funding formula values, which is obviously the objective at the start of the year. That's the money the government give us for school. So if we can pass that on in full, that's great, but we know there are reasons why that can't happen. And then the second part is, because you'll see from the report, we do have a surplus. We've got to make a decision about how that money's being used, and there are a few options around there, but from the point of view of the council, there are very, very limited options, but obviously we can have a discussion about that. So I think it would be easier to just go through and say, well, hey, this is how the budget's changed. We got to that level. Is there any questions at that point in time? And then we have a bit more of a debate about, well, what can we do with that money, and what restrictions have we got, etc. So I think it would just be easier to go through the paper, if that's okay then. Okay, so I'll just go to that first part then. So again, this is the final set of proposals for the school's budget. So we've got to make some decisions tonight, because we've got to get information and confirmation to the DfE by the 23rd of 20th of January. So 23rd is the delivering better value. So they've got quite a lot on in January, the DfE, obviously. This is sort of focusing around recommendation 3.11. And what this paper is, it's the next iteration of the paper that you had in December. So there's no new changes in terms of budget initiatives that have come through, any new pressures, any new savers. All this is doing really is updating the figures now that we have the confirmed October 2022 census, because prior to this we were working on an estimate, and there have been some changes on that. And one of the things, just to confirm again, which did mention last time, that the pupil numbers are showing a steady increase now for the first time in a number of years. They've gone up 2.3% over the year. Last 3 years on average it was a 0.9%, and this is the first year we had an increase in both primary and secondary for 5 years. So there, it's quite a small increase, but it's still an increase, and it's obviously going to help out in terms of places, pupil numbers for schools as well. The other thing to mention, I think, is one of the big factors, as I mentioned earlier, about the lagged funding system. There's been a big increase in additional educational needs characteristics of pupils between October 21 and 22. Councils funded on the 21 data. We have to fund schools on the 22 data. There's been a big increase in the number of children with English as an additional language, and a lot of that is down to the resettlement programs for Ukrainians in Hong Kong, but there's other parts of that as well. There's been a big increase in free school meal numbers, which again, the economic circumstances in the country at the moment would indicate you'd expect that. And there's also been additional funding allocated mainly to primary schools through low prior attainment scores, where they continue to need additional support. Secondary scores are improving, so the allocations have gone down in that phase. But overall, all those changes come up with a £455,000 pressure, for which the council doesn't get the money for, but obviously through the way that the funding operation works, that has to be passed on to schools up to an affordable level. Another thing to put out from this is that we've got a lot less schools now on the minimum per pupil funding level. So this is the cash limit that the DfE, the absolute minimum amount per pupil funding each school can get each year. So we had 14 schools on that in 22-23. That's now gone down to 6. And what happens here is sometimes that's moving schools off a protected level, so they get more money than would be expected through the funding formula, to the actual amount through the funding formula. And if you cross from one calculation to the other, you can end up getting very small increases, because you lose that top-up funding to get you to an acceptable level before. But if you now get that through the normal operation of the funding formula, it can be a very small increase. You're there at the level expected, but one of the consequences is that as you make that last step, you can get quite a small funding increase. And we've got 8 schools in that position next year, and they're all in the primary phase. So they're the main things I wanted to point out about the data changes, which are in the paper there, and you'll see at the end of that there is an overall surplus of £188,000. We were expecting a small surplus when we reported in December, but that was £46,000. So that's another £142,000 than we were expecting last time. And within the report itself, you would have seen that that has arisen because we had quite a few one-off gains of funding, mainly through the lagged funding system, but also how it links in with the way that we were funding King's Academy New School, because we're still getting funded on the old numbers of the King's Academy, but we've drastically reduced the amount of money we're passing on to them. So that happens just once, because then those two funding systems catch up next year. But that's the main reason we've been able to get into a position where for the current financial year, we had to top slice school budgets by 0.25% because we couldn't afford the national funding formula rates. Now we've got more money than would be expected through the national funding formula. But it looks like this is a pretty unique year, but obviously it's great to be in this position at this point in time. So I think it would just be easier if possibly you could see if there's any questions on setting the budget through the process as set out in the report to get to the level of the national funding formula values, which is always the first objective of the budget setting process. So if there's any questions on that, I think I'd like to see if we can manage those first and then go on to, well, what do we do next?
Okay, any questions for Paul?
Wow.
Oh, Paul, I'll ask.
No. Go on.
This looks like it looks like it's good news, better than expected. Is that my reading? Is that correct?
Definitely, yeah. Yes, that's right, yeah.
Okay. So unless anybody else has got any queries, if we go to page 38, so this is for us to agree, and at the moment we're being asked to agree to 3.1.1.
Yeah,
Anybody,
I think sorry, Stu, yeah.
Anybody disagree with that? Okay, so if we're happy with that, forum agrees to that, and then we'll do 2, 3, and 4.
Yeah, we do 3.1.2 by itself, and then we come back to the other ones, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So obviously we've got to the position where we've got the surplus, and now it's a case of, well, what can we do with that? And unfortunately, with education funding, it's not as straightforward as you'd hope it would be. And the other thing we need to build into this is any decisions we make now in use of that surplus, we need to make sure that that's not going to create further financial challenges for us in 24-25. So we've done some projections into 24-25, and we've adjusted for those one-off funding factors that we've going for this year and other big changes that we're expecting to see, and summarize that in table 2, which is on page 46. And that shows that the final column on the right shows that those big changes that we're quite certain will happen in 24-25 do represent a deficit, a starting point of £423,000. So we're going again from a surplus to a deficit because of the way the funding system works, and then going forward, if we keep getting increases in additional educational needs characteristics, that will continue to be a pressure every year as we go through the system. But there's a lot of things that could change before then. So we've got £188,000. What we do want to make sure that goes to schools as best we can, but we want to make sure that we don't create further problems in 24-25. And the main thing we need to look out for on that is that when we set the 24-25 budget, we will have to provide minimum per pupil increases to schools. So if we set a higher baseline this year than we need to, those increases in the next year will be even higher and maybe more unaffordable than is the case if we can pass money on to schools through a mechanism that doesn't bake in some funding into the baseline, and then that baseline starting from scratch again. So that's what we got. So the proposals we're saying is let's give some money to schools as much as we can this year, but we don't want to do anything that bakes in problems that create a possibly even a bigger deficit than we're looking at now. That's £423,000. So that's where we come into, well, what can we do with that money? That's the approach we're taking. And the way that the system's working now, the DfE have introduced more control mechanisms into local authority funding for next year. And this is part of their step to mandate local authorities to replicate the national funding formula. So we're very, very close. A number of authorities are still some way to go. And those ones that are a long way to go have got to move at least 10% closer to the national funding formula this year. If you're close to it, which we are, if you're within 2.5% of it, and we're 0.25%, then they want to make you stay in that within that parameter. So all we can do on our factor values for 23-24 is increase them 2.5% above or below the level that the DfE say the national funding formula values will be. Okay, so anything we change is limited by that parameter. And the only factor that we can use that won't bake in any funding into our baseline into next year, and therefore increase our deficit, is the fixed lump sum. Okay, so that's the same amount of cash funding for every single school, irrespective of size. And the maximum we can allocate for that is the £3,385 per school. And that equates to just over £100,000. So of that £188,000, we are recommending £101,000 is given out in an equal lump sum to every school, and that minimises any problems we've got in 24-25. And then there's £87,000 left, which we are proposing is basically earmarked into a reserve to help us as a surplus at the start of 24-25 that would also be then available to draw down if we need it to help balance that gap as well. So that's the approach we are recommending. And I said that there's quite a lot of, why can't we do this? Why can't we do that? There are quite a lot of rules that are pointing us just down to one very, very narrow path, to be quite honest. So hopefully that's been explained why we're doing it that way. And I guess I just see, are there any comments, suggestions, questions?
Any questions or comments? Grant.
Thanks, Paul. And the paper was very comprehensive, and I think a very narrow path. But the question I had, and apologies if I've missed this in the paper, so this year we've got a bit more money than we think we've got. Next financial year, we may actually have slightly less money than we think. Are we allowed, or is there in fact any sense in fact not giving £3,000 extra, which in the cosmic scale of things may not make a much difference? Is there any mileage in not spending it, putting it in a reserve and using it the following financial year to dampen the hit, if I've understood what you've said correctly? And the second thing I was also thinking, and again, I know the answer is going to be no because the rules don't allow it, but you mentioned there are schools that I think 8 of them that are going to get a relatively small increase because of the minimum funding guarantee and all that sort of stuff. Is there any mechanism in which the council, it's not passed on, it sits in the central fund and the council has some discretionary ability to support schools in a slightly different way, so that actually schools are targeted that might need the money, and those schools that are perhaps actually not going to need £3,000 to balance their budget as compared to a single form entry primary school where that actually might be the difference between a balanced budget and what have you. Is there any mileage in either of those two things? So I'm sorry if that was a bit rambling, but my questions.
No, it's good to get questions. I hope I can answer. So the point about putting all of that money into reserves, that's definitely an option, and that would help. I think on balance, the council's view is that schools should get some of that money now, because although we've said you're getting even if we exceed the amount of money that the DfE have given us to pass on to schools, it's still not going to be enough to cover the cost increases we expect to face next year. So there would be an even bigger challenge without that. So I think, well, from our point of view, it's it does seem more balanced to give some for this year to help cover the shortfall we think will be there, but also have a little bit in our back pocket effectively to possibly help us into the next financial year. It's just striking a balance. So you could do all of the money into reserves, but you can't put any more than £101,000 into schools' budgets without, as I say, building in even bigger problems for 24-25, which we would have to recommend against from a financial perspective. Is that all right on that one? Okay, and the second one, no, you're right. We're not allowed to do that sort of thing. The whole point is that the DfE controlling how money is distributed to schools, and you have to use the factors of the national funding formula for the very reason that then local authorities can't just, for want of a better phrase, give out money to who they want to. It has to be done through objective data, proper funding factors. So it'd be nice to be able to do that on a number of different things, I think, but we're just not allowed to, I'm afraid.
Grant, are you happy with the proposal? Does Paul's response bring us back to point 2?
Thank you, Paul, for your answers.
Okay. Yeah. Are there any other queries or questions on this one? Okay, in that case, we go to 3.1.2. So we're being asked to agree how that surplus funding is allocated. And are there any dissent to the proposal? Okay, so that is agreed. Paul, are you doing 3.1, 3 and 4 now? you're on mute.
Thank you. Sorry, I think I should have said something in my earlier part of the talk there. Obviously, there's a new grant that's coming out as well.
Can I just say at this point, then I'm handing over to, sorry if there's more to come, I'm handing over to Liz because I've got to go, but thank you very much. See you next time, guys. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks, Stuart. Thank you.
See you.
Yeah, so I mean, what I was talking about was the allocation of the money through the local government, the local authority funding formula. We've also, in the budget statement, there was another allocation of funds on top of that, which we didn't know how that was going to be done when we spoke last time. And that's now been confirmed. It will be a new grant called the Mainstream Schools Additional Grant. So that's one-off funding that will be added into the Bracknell Forest formula in the year after that, but for 1 year only, it'll be a separate grant, and that's going to be very, very similar to this school supplementary grant you got this year. So an amount per pupil, an amount per school, and an amount per free school, every 6 free school meal child. So it's very similar. So that increases your average by 3.4%. There's an average 2.8% through the Bracknell Forest formula, 6.2% average increase in funding for all schools, but our forecast for costs is between 6.5% and 8%. And obviously there's a lot of variables in our forecast for 23-24, utilities, payables, those sort of things. We don't really know the final figures on those yet. So I just wanted to say that that's the final position on the budget. So it's a 6.2% average increase in funding, but costs will be higher than that on our data. So yes, sorry, that's all I wanted to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So if there's any other comments or questions before we go to recommendations. Okay, so we're still on page 38. So we have 3.1.3, the other school block related grants, including the new Mainstream Schools additional grant, to be set at the amounts anticipated for 23-24. Nods and assents. Thank you. And then 3.1.4, that the Executive Director resources to be authorised to submit it to the DfE pro forma template of the 23-24 Bracknell funding formula for schools in accordance with the decisions taken at this meeting. Thank you very much. And then we've got 3.2.1 as the decision maker, that the arrangements in place for the administration of central government grants are appropriate. I can see nods. For those people who've been here for a while, that's a nice thing to hear. And 3.2.2, that the budgets for the growth fund are as set out in Annex 1. Waves and snarls and nods. Joanna, say if I'm going too fast. 3.2.3, that the budgets to be centrally managed by the council on behalf of schools as set out in Annex 2. Nods, snarls, thumbs up. Thank you. So no further ado, we're going to move to agenda item 7, and then that's back over to you, Paul, if I'm right.
That is, thank you very much, Liz. Yes, so this is part of the council's budget process. The consultation is to seek views from the schools forum on our budget plans, and there's obviously the report focuses on the plans for the People Directorate because that has the biggest impact and influence on schools. So we have a budget proposal out for consultation at the moment. They will be coming back. Any comments will be consolidated and incorporated and considered before the final budget proposals come out in February. And that's when we will set our budgets for the central funds. So again, this is a very similar layout and areas that are covered by this report each year. So there's 5 key parts of the council's budget. So we start off with this is on revenue. So we start off with the commitment budget. So any of our prior year decisions, if they have a different full year effect in 23-24, then we'd need to build that into the budget. So they can be additional pressures or they can be additional savings. So that's the starting point, making sure we get our baseline correct. And there's £570,000 worth of additional net costs for the People Directorate, and that's mostly around some of the social care. So it's around enhanced payments to social workers and also an enhanced foster carer payment scheme. So there's a couple of big things in there that relate to the People Directorate. One of the big parts of the funding for the council is grants. So we already expected to get a share of a £1.5 billion grant from central government for the adult social care reforms. Those reforms have been deferred, but the local authorities can keep that money to help with their general pressures on adult social care. And in addition to that, there's going to be another £1.3 million general social care grant. So that'll be for children and adults, again, to reflect the demand and the cost pressures in those two service areas. Then we look at, well, what are our budget pressures have we got for next year? And there are just over £4 million worth of pressures there, of which £2.2 million is the People Directorate, and most of that, £1.7 million, relates to adult social care demographics. But there are a couple of education-related areas in those pressures. So there are some pressures, and these are in Annex B. I didn't put that on my note. That's not very good of me. So I think they're in Annex B. So you can see there's some pressure around the loss of a school improvement grant and a license fee cost for the Can Do trade-in platform, which is in excess of our budget. And there's also some proposals for some additional staff. So there is a designated social care worker to look after children, to concentrate on supporting children with education and healthcare plans. And there's also some additional resources into IAS, the independent assessment well, I think I can't remember what it is, but it's an independent service for parents with their children undergoing special educational needs assessments. So those are the pressures specific to education. And then obviously we've got some economies and savings as well. And they're a very big £7.7 million. And part of that is because we've got some very significant one-off savings that are not going to repeat themselves in future. The biggest chunk of which is a £1.7 million saving on children's social care, where there's some one-off gains that we've got on those budgets as well that won't be repeated. So that's a big increase. And then there are some other smaller savings that are set out in Annex C. And the other big thing that we have is obviously our inflation provision. So what would normally be a £2 to £3 million cost is going to be a £9.8 million cost next year. So obviously that's a huge change that we're facing there. That's a lot because a lot of our contracts will be fixed by RPI, and it's RPI plus on some of those as well. And it's utilities as well, like schools. So the bottom line of all that is that we've got a budget gap next year of £8.2 million. We normally have a budget gap of £3 to £4 million. So that's obviously a big increase, but it's something that we have been expecting it to be larger because of the circumstances we're facing. So that will need to be covered either by an increase in council tax or use of our reserves, or looking for further savings. So that's something that will be decided when the final budget proposals come from the council in February. And then on capital, there's a very, very small capital program. Most of it's the devolved formula capital that schools get, and also the maintenance grant that we get to support schools on some of the larger costs of projects. And there's a small amount of developer contribution to help with the perimeter fencing works at Ascot Heath, and that's set out on Annex D and E. So that's a quick rundown of what our proposals for the council are next year. And it's just a case of are there any comments that you want to make generally across those as the schools forum, or is there anything specific on the People Directorate ones that you would like to raise now? And then we can feed that back as the consultation process.
That's something that Bracknell's going to issue with.
I don't know if it's just me, but your sound's not coming through very clear, Liz.
Just to say, I thought there was
it's still yeah. It's getting worse, I'm afraid.
It sounds like you're in a tunnel.
Sounds a bit like Yoda.
We're still having difficulty, Liz, but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's one of those things, isn't it? You can either fix it or you can't.
Just leave it like it is. It's entertaining. You're all good.
You have to play it back to me.
Oh, that's fine now. You're right now.
Oh, you're
to
back
normal.
now.
You're back to
Okay.
normal, yeah.
Back to normal. I turned my volume down. I did. My comment was that how much do we have as an issue of recruitment and retention in this area? You're saying that we've put more money.
Yeah, that's for social workers. So
Yeah.
that's on the back of, yes, we have a high percentage of agency work in workers in children's social care. Adult social care, not so much, but there are vacancies, and it's part of a plan to develop the service, because the forecasts are that there's going to be a shortage of social workers, particularly if these now deferred reforms come into place. There will be a growth in social workers. So it's planning to make sure that we're not left behind when that happens.
And I know it's a national thing for social work.
Yeah.
But in comparison to our statistical neighbours, are we better? Are we worse?
It does go round in cycles. At the moment, we're doing quite well in children's social care because we've got a very good service, which was demonstrated through the Ofsted. So they got an outstanding. So that does attract staff to those areas. But we've still got 15 to 20% agency staff because there is a shortage of children's social workers out there. But other authorities would tend to be higher than that. But it's still, obviously, it's not best practice to have agency workers supporting children on plans and such like. So there is efforts to change that. But the bulk of the change is adult social care staff. There's only a small increase for children's social care.
Thank you, Paul. So let's go to recommendations, if I'm not sounding like Yoda now. Good. Okay, so 2.1, the Schools Forum comments on the 23-24 budget proposals that the executive people treat in respect of. Firstly, the revenue budgets, annexes A to C. And then we've got the capital programme, Annex D. Everybody agreed? Okay, thank you very much. So we have come to the end of the meeting. So huge thanks to Stuart, who chaired for the first half, and thank you to Cherry and to Paul specifically, who presented, and to Cheryl, and to anybody else who's contributed, and Joanna too, who has been making the notes. Stay safe and have a good evening.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Liz, and thank you to Stuart as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep, thank you.
Bye,
Thanks,
everybody.
Liz.
Thank you.
Yep.